Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCDN here with Madison Marks from UNICEF Ventures for season 10. I think it's episode 9 of the Social Change Career Podcast. We're delighted that Madison is taking time out of her busy afternoon to share her wisdom, experience, and career tips with us. Today, we're going to be talking about connecting, convening, and curating ideas for impact at scale. Very cool title. Madison has been working in development and innovation and startups around the world for the past 15 to 20 years. She has worked at the Johns Hopkins Social Innovation Lab, the Expo 2020 in Dubai, American Councils for International Education, the Qatar Foundation International, and she's really worked, I can't keep track of how many countries, but around the world. She holds an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University. Go Hoyas. We'll have to talk. I never made it to a basketball game, embarrassed to say, and a BA in Middle East Studies from Florida State University, and is currently doing an executive MBA to keep learning. She was previously on the board of the Middle East North Africa Regional Fellowship Program and serves as a startup coach for incubators and accelerators around the world. So Madison, thank you so much. So for people joining us for the first time, what we'll do is I'll ask a few questions, and particularly on LinkedIn, we would love if, as we're starting off, if you would let us know in the chat box on LinkedIn where you're watching from, and if you want to share a sentence or two about your interests in this topic. And then after about 10 minutes, we would love to bring in questions from the audience. So feel free to share your questions, your comments, or tips and recommendations. The podcast will go for about 50 minutes. And then you can watch this video on LinkedIn or YouTube, and then we convert it to one of our podcast episodes in about a week or two. To make a little bit of a plug, the podcast is in its 10th season. We have done Catalina and I, over 100 interviews with brilliant innovators from all around the world. And the one thing we would ask, if you listen to it, share it, and then also especially rate it, whether it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google. But if you rate it, it helps us grow our impact and reach. So Madison, thanks so much again for joining us. And how is the weather in Stockholm? Hopefully it's almost
actually
spring.
sunny today. Yeah, it's sunny and warmer, so all smiles here. I'm glad to be
How
here.
warm is warm?
You don't need a winter parka. You could probably get away with a in the States, for those who do Fahrenheit, it's probably in the high 40s, 50s.
Okay, wonderful. So again, while you're watching, please feel free to put in the comments where you're watching from. I'll put that into LinkedIn. So Madison, can you talk a little bit about, is there a theme in terms of the type of impact or change you've been seeking to influence or make happen throughout your career?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the title for this podcast, Connecting, Convening, and Curating Ideas for Impact at Scale, came from a conversation that we had around how we would plug our own career over the last several years. And I think for me, I entered into my first role, which was in supporting programs for youth. In many ways, a lot of my jobs over the years, whether it's been supporting youth or entrepreneurs, has been around curating opportunities for young people or entrepreneurs, proximity founders, those closest to the problems and the challenges that they're trying to solve. How can we create an environment for them to be able to access the resources they need, the knowledge and capacity building, to be able to build sustainable ventures, test ideas, and ultimately the goal would be to scale impact. So in the roles I've sought out, and the roles I also feel like I excel in, are those either representing funds or capacity building in organizations that do acceleration, incubation, that support founders. And so being able to bring in the right resources, the right network, and also be a representative of these founders in ecosystems to be able to amplify their voices. So really my goal has been to connect ideas, connect people, convene in meaningful ways, and curate ideas. There's a lot of ideas, but there's few that scale. And so really try to bring together those ideas that can have the most impact. But when I talk about scale, and I'll tell you about this later on, my career has seen scale mean from one neighborhood to the next, but it's also meant, scaling to millions, or scaling from one geographic location to another, or multiple contexts. So that's sort of how I'll start framing my career. And so in everything I do, I really try to be in different roles, continue the stream of being able to support founders, because ultimately at the end of the day, they're the ones building the solutions that hopefully will be sustainable, and interventions on the ground that a lot of organizations, governments, IGOs miss.
Wonderful, and thank you to everyone for joining us. So Megan and Paul is here from RippleWorks. If people don't know RippleWorks, check them out. They're amazing, kind of like a McKinsey for social impact. Welcome Alejandro from Costa Rica, Stephanie from Indonesia, Abu Bakar from Kenya, some other people from just listed as LinkedIn users, but please let us know where you're watching from. Yeah. Hi, Madison's mom. Feel free to start putting in your questions and comments. So Madison, I mean, I was a professor at Georgetown for 10 years. I still teach there. The MENA studies, master's, was really strong. So just to think back, like when you were doing your undergrad or grad, how did you go from like a MENA focus, Middle East, North Africa? Was your goal to kind of be at the intersection of development and startups, or were you, envisioning yourself more in a traditional development role? So if you think back 20 years, like what did you envision where you might go? And is that, did these terms even exist back then?
So in terms of where I first set out to be, I didn't have, like a lot of people come into an area studies degree intending to work for a specific reason. I was curious. I grew up in an area where there was a large misunderstanding of the Middle East and North Africa region. And so I wanted to be able to learn for myself. So I actually started with the curiosity to be able to figure out where this would lead. And so for me, it was language and culture studies, and of course the geopolitics and history and such that inform the areas of the world that we're studying. But my first impetus when I went in was the only careers that you could have in the international realm were either military, diplomat, or a missionary. That's basically the three that I grew up with. And then when I went to the Middle East for the first time, which was in 2011, so it was right after what they called the Arab Spring. So the voices of young people were being amplified, whether in the streets, but especially in the digital realm. I was fascinated with the different turnouts, I guess, or you would say effects of how governments were responding to youth. Everyone could get around economic development. Obviously, I stay away from politics because I think the best way to support young people is providing opportunities. And there was a hunger when I was in the region in 2011, I was in Jordan. There was a hunger for young people to be able to make a change, to be able to shape not only policies, but also companies and impact social issues that they were passionate about. So for me, it was working with young people. That was initially my impetus. And so the first job I had was with Qatar Foundation International in Washington, D.C. Their whole mission was around cultural exchange and youth engagement, supporting Arabic language and culture educations in public schools. So for me, it was a natural fit. I'd spent a lot of time studying Arabic, focusing on cultural exchange. But I found my interests were much broader. And so I wanted to be working with young people on the ground. So when I say young people, solutions builders, that kind of goes up to 35, but I really just enjoy working with entrepreneurs. And so I found the best way that I could work with governments and the various ecosystem players, whether that's investors, corporates, banks, to support young people was through economic development via entrepreneurship. And so for me, I actually made a pivot at Georgetown, despite doing my degree in Arab studies, going back to your question. I knew that I could get a fully funded or mostly funded graduate program in an area studies if I honed into my expertise. I just creatively crafted my journey there to take courses in like a hacking for defense class so I could learn lean startup methodology. I tailored all of my papers on economic development. I took trips to the region and networked. And so by the time I graduated from my master's, I had made a decision that I was making it clear that this was my first big career pivot into the entrepreneurship space. And I'd figured out my storytelling around it. So, it made sense given the work I'd done in the philanthropic space, supporting programs and education with youth. But I wanted to work and understand more of the business and how all of the different factors play into really driving economic growth and youth participation in that.
Sorry, I had my mic on mute just because I was typing.
No worries.
So thank you, Stephanie. Welcome to India, a user from India. And please let us know where you're watching from and your questions. So Madison, one question, let's say, for your recommendations for people who want to engage at this intersection of startups, social impact, and whether it's development or social change or just business for good. Let's say someone is still in university or graduate school, not that you have to do that. I mean, I really like how you talk about hacking your education and making sure that you started to build the skills and expertise and connections to kind of go in this area. So if someone is still in university or not, what are some of your recommendations about the skills or the knowledge areas that you would encourage people to consider developing to be competitive for the jobs of now in the next 5 to 10 years?
Sure. So I think there's a number of generalist roles, and I'll put myself in that category for the way I've been able to transition around different companies. So because I understand entrepreneurship and all of the nuts and bolts of what it takes to build a business, but also have a background. So I should also say I've had a number of different hats in these roles. So I went from, program management to community program manager, where I was driving ecosystem partnerships across the Middle East on behalf of funders, to communications and marketing, to then being basically the managing director of accelerators. And now I'm a portfolio strategist with UNICEF. So all of these titles have always involved a couple of key skills. So one is knowing how to take a bunch of different pieces of information and put them together in an organized way and build programs or streams to support different needs that are incoming. So if you're working in the entrepreneurship or business for good space, or you're even just working with a startup, there's a lot that's changing in real time. And so being able to understand, how to drive core leadership skills, core business skills, and bring in the right experts to teach entrepreneurs fundamentals around resilience. And it's not just about your business acumen, but it's like, do you understand your customer? Are you building something that's an actual need, or you're going to generate a need if you're thinking ahead of the times? So, in terms of what I would encourage people, if you're looking at, if you're in grad school or in university, I would take a business course so you understand the fundamentals of business. If you're jumping into it, it can be confusing, but one business course can support. It helps to understand finance and budgeting. It also helps to understand what are the key drivers in the social impact space. And so sometimes it's divided into nonprofit, or it might be put into like a social impact or social innovation space. So I think figuring out what the class titles are, that will give you information around, if, for example, if you're in the US, like how does the money drive to these social organizations? There's a huge philanthropic space in the US that many other places in the world don't necessarily have, or they rely on big foundations or corporates to kind of drive those sectors. And so I would just kind of figure out and expose yourself to a general overview, but then if you want to go specific, start following news. So, read thought experts, follow people on LinkedIn, I always say read The Economist. It's great because it gives you an overview of the world. But it also dives into topics like health, technology, climate, education. And so it gives you an exposure to what's happening around the world. So I think there's a lot of things you can do by curating your, your education, so your core curricula, but also your core learning. There's tons of micro learning opportunities these days. So engaging in short courses, or, like listening to podcasts, curating, but showing up to networking events, even if you're not necessarily curious about networking with that group, but if it's a topic that you're interested in, you're likely to learn something. And I would also say, internships were a great way that I found exposure to different sectors. I found that I get really, really bored in research institutions. I like doing things and being hands-on. But being able to have direct experience is helpful. You can also volunteer with organizations. There's ways that you can do micro volunteer opportunities. And finally, interviews. So just like I would say, customer discovery. So this is a startup term where we talk about getting to know your customer, but basically interviewing people who are in organizations that you're interested in or have had interesting career paths can help you drive insights of how they've done it. And I'll always say your storytelling is your best asset. So if you can figure out how you bring all of your different interests into a clear, cohesive narrative, it will help. The best thing I ever learned, so gosh, it was 10 years ago now. I was a finalist for the Rhodes Scholarship, and the interview process was grueling, but the storytelling skills I gained from that experience have served me for life. So, learning how to bring things together and craft it. And it can be challenging. You can test it with people, test it with friends, test it with professors, test it with coaches. But I would just say some of those soft skills and being able to bring things together. But of course, if you're a generalist, be organized, know how to do communications, know how to, how to speak the language of the sectors you're going with. Even if you don't go deep, just knowing enough about the language and vernacular they're using is helpful.
Wonderful. And welcome Miali from Madagascar, Jacqueline from Kenya. I put in two just great resources. One is Rest of the World is a great free publication all about the tech world in the global south, whatever term you want to use, and you can get great things. And for people who are founders, I think you have to be under 24. Alexis Ohanian, the founder of Reddit, and just amazing. And his wife is Serena Williams, so they're both superstars. But he has a foundation called 776 Foundation, which has a fellowship for founders or potential founders, I think 18 to 23, who want to build startups or are building startups related to the climate space. The deadline's in a couple of days, but it's open to the world and incredible. And I would just add one thing to all the suggestions Madison said, also just fellowships. There's so many fellowships out there that I'm reviewing for the Rise Fellowship from Smith Futures, but there's so many fellowships out there, Rotary and Peace Fellowship, which advertises in PCDN, but Acumen, Echoing Green, there's so many fellowships now around the world that are focused on this intersection. So please let us know. Please let us know where you're watching from. And again, we'd love to hear questions. I don't want to be the only one asking questions. So next thing is, just to jump into it, everybody, a lot of people dream about working for multilateral organizations, and you've worked for startups, for academia, for multilaterals, for all these things. And I don't want to ask you to say the pros and cons of each, but any advice for someone who is trying to decide, what type of organization they want to work for, or the size, like whether be part of a scrappy startup of 5 people or a nonprofit, or go to a place that has 10,000. So someone that has figured out like their passion and has some skills or enough skills, what is your advice about like where to look? Like, if you want stability, go for this. If you want burnout but excitement, go for this. So any thoughts when people come to you for advice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I should say I now work with UNICEF, but I applied for the UN for about 10 years and I got one bite, and it was because I was in the Gulf on fundraising. So it's interesting that my work with founders has now been an interesting segue into working with UNICEF Venture Fund, which I'll just give a brief quickly of what I do for context, and then sort of I'll backtrack and answer your question, Craig. So right now, as a portfolio strategist with the UNICEF Venture Fund, I support early stage companies that are operating in UNICEF countries who are using what we call frontier technology, so things like AI, blockchain, drones, extended reality. And they are building solutions that have the potential to impact children. So what does that mean? That could be in climate, education, health, supply chain. So basically, over the last 6 years, I would say, because this is really where my entrepreneurship work has been, I've been supporting founders in a number of different roles. So as Craig said, I've supported founders in small organizations. And actually, I found my entrance into the entrepreneurship space through a small organization that took a risk on me, knowing that I knew the region, I knew had all the skills. I just might not have the network, but I could build that quickly. And so I think getting in your foot in the door, it might be beneficial to start at a small organization. But that said, be prepared to hustle. You wear many hats. It's full on. So, and it can lead to quick burnout. It can also lead to, sometimes if it's an early company, it might not be the right fit for you in the long term. So there's changes happening in the strategic direction. So I've actually been through moments where I've realized I was not the right person for the role and stepped down. I've been through moments of restructuring, and I've been through moments of layoff over the last couple of years, just due to COVID and a number of other things. But so I started in a small organization, and then I moved into a larger organization that still operated in small clusters. And I think I really enjoyed that, but I wanted to be able to understand what it was like to mobilize support for entrepreneurs at scale. And so I joined Expo 2020 Dubai, which was, for those contexts, they had a fund that was supporting early stage founders. I brought together my understanding of startups and marketing and comms to help build the strategy for how their 100 plus investments would integrate into the 6-month event. So for me, that was my first big bureaucratic organization, because you're working with a government entity that has people and representatives from all over the world trying to coordinate in a way, where millions of people are going to come through the site. So how do you have high impact but also low impact? High touch but low impact. I think low touch but high impact engagement, and then opposite. So it was a very good learning experience, and I think that helped me work in bureaucratic organizations. So I then moved to Johns Hopkins, which by nature, it's one of the largest employers in Maryland, does have quite a lot of bureaucracies, which is normal. But I learned how to work creatively, and I had a role where for me, it would have been a dream role years ago, but in fact, I found myself so burnt out that I couldn't continue. It just wasn't, I needed a place where I was with a team and I could be around people that I was learning from, I could bounce ideas off of. Before I joined UNICEF, I spent 2 years in a role where I was basically a one woman shop with about 5 different hats, and I was burnt out and exhausted. And I needed to be in a place where, despite you giving and you're learning a lot and it's exciting and you can have an impact, if you're not having someone feed into you, it can get really exhausting. So sometimes the benefit of larger organizations is you do have a team. There are different learning opportunities and growth opportunities. The UN is a bit hard to navigate because there's different contracting methodologies, but I work with a really great team. So I work with the ventures team that's looking at emerging technologies. So I actually find a lot of my learning in this space. So, how do you innovate within such a large multilateral comes from being with really smart, engaged, excited colleagues. But still, yes, we run against bureaucracy all the time. So there are moments I'm like, oh, I want to run back to like being able to make the decision myself. But also I think there's learnings in being patient and learning how to work within large systems. But also because I have been in that seat, not necessarily as a founder, but as the head of an entity, I can understand how my startups are feeling when they're trying to break into working with the UN or governments. And so I think being able to bridge those worlds has been really helpful. How do you get in those, and how do you feel? Like it's hard to say. I would say an internship is the best way, so you don't spend a lot of time. The good thing about if you can get into the UN is that they're short-term contracts, so you don't have to commit for a long time. But there's also downsides to that too in terms of stability. So, I think just looking at different things in your life, I'm actually looking for something a little bit more stable now that I'm moving into a different section of my career. Because I had so much, because my time from like 2017 to 2022, there was rapid changes in contracts. And the other thing in the social impact space, particularly working with startups, is there's a lot of short-term contracts and people kind of move around. And so you should also be prepared to explain that if you're moving into a different sector with a multilateral, why have you moved around so much? That's something I'm actually facing, or I've had in my last interview cycle faced.
Thank you so much. So just 2 comments, and then Liz has a question I'll bring in, and please keep letting your questions come in, and welcome. I think we had a user just join us from Nigeria. So I think we have a lot of the world, but nobody in Latin America apart from me. So let me know if there's other Latin American-based people. So one is just, it's funny that 10 years ago the advice would be, if you're in a job, don't leave too soon unless under extenuating circumstances, and that generally meant like 1 to 3 years. And
yeah.
And now it's like, it depends, it's still in the civil service, that's not true. But in a lot of sectors, when people stay at a job now for a long time, a lot of people are like, what's wrong? And it's almost become much more acceptable, not everywhere around the world, but to switch sectors, jobs, and careers. And there's also so little stability in formal employment now. But let me bring in Liz's question. So Liz says, I recently finished my MA in social innovation, I think in the Northwest US. It's been a bit of a challenge in finding a job at social impact organizations that are not nonprofit. Other than looking at B Corp, what are some suggestions you have to seek out opportunities in this social impact and innovation space? So any favorite resources, recommendations, or for people who want to do impact work, but maybe not at a nonprofit?
Yeah, I actually work with mostly organizations, when I've worked with accelerators, that are not necessarily what you would consider a social enterprise. They're a tech startup that has an ultimate aim to use their technology or their product or service for, for the betterment of people and planet. I'll just summarize it as that. But I would start by looking in the skill sets that you want to bring to the table. So are there certain job titles, or I guess, as you're looking at the social innovation and social impact space, my question back to you would be, okay, what are you looking to do? Are you just looking to be exposed to something? Or are you looking to use a hard skill? Like if you've got skills in data or engineering, it's going to be easier for you to enter multiple organizations because there's a lot of need for tech talent. And then you can be aligned with the organization from a mission standpoint. So there are lots of rosters that put out jobs on behalf of their companies. I know Megan's here, and I believe that one was just launched that maybe we can put in the chat. That would be helpful.
RippleWorks just launched a meta job board, so I'll put it in there.
Yeah, so sometimes you can look at investors or convening organizations that have invested in a number of different types of startups and look at their job boards. You could also consider who is enabling the social innovation space. So that could be things like corporates with CSR roles, so corporate social responsibility. It could be looking at, foundations are kind of in the nonprofit space, but looking at organizations that sort of enable networks, whether that's like networks of leadership, networks for women, like there's organizations that kind of have a social mission that you can also look. So I would really just look at what's the sector you want to get into, who are the startups in that space, and see what types of roles are available. That's just more of a startup perspective. So obviously I don't want to degrade corporate institutions. There's a lot of good corporate institutions that have value alignment, and you can also start a career in these corporates, whether it's consulting or like the large corporate consultants also have social impact arms now.
Wonderful. So I put in the RippleWorks thing, the PCDN Career Campus. I think it's amazing. We also have the world's best meta job board of social impact job boards. And Megan is just asking, she's why not at a nonprofit? So if you want to add anything to your question, but I'll say personally, I don't differentiate between for-profit, nonprofit, foundation, multilateral. I think they all do good things and they all have challenges and do some bad things. And I think in the past used to be nonprofit good, private sector bad. I mean, I'm simplifying, but among people really focused on social impact. And there's so much dysfunction in all areas. And so to me, it's more like, what type of change do you want to focus on advancing the world where you have the skills and there's actually paid opportunities? And then don't focus on, I also know too many people say, I only want to work for the UN, but UN is great, but it's very bureaucratic. It can be slow. So sometimes it's best to be part of a nimble startup or a foundation or a network hub. So in my opinion, too many people say, I want to work for X type of organization without understanding I call it the marketplace of change, like where the jobs are and the funding and opportunities. So please keep the questions coming and the comments, and I'll ask one now. So Madison, many people in the world, actually, here comes a question from Alejandro in Costa Rica, so I'll bring this in. So for people who don't know the SDGs, hopefully everybody does. If not, please look them up. SDG is the partnership one. So Alejandro is asking, do you consider creating alliances based, what SDG is all about? Partnerships is a good place when thinking about social innovation opportunities. So any thoughts on that, Madison?
Yeah, so we can't achieve the SDGs without partnerships and collaboration from every sector and from government to CSOs, civil society organizations, young people. That's what I spend a lot of time thinking about. So having a diverse group of folks that can feed in the different perspectives is really key. Now, in terms of it's a good place when thinking about social innovation opportunities, yes, there are alliances that are constantly working on new initiatives. For example, so within UNICEF, we're part of what's called the Digital Public Goods Alliance. There's a whole movement now around digital public goods, and so an alliance will get, an organization. They'll have dedicated people, but then they'll also start building out more opportunities for cohesiveness among all of the members and also to raise awareness of XYZ. So yes, it is a good place to think about when looking at social innovation opportunities. It's also a great place to think about when looking at the organizations that are part of it that you could identify as potential employers or places to target if this is just about employment, but also for funding. So there's a lot of great alliances that come together. I think about I'm a big fan of TED's Audacious Project. So they bring together a bunch of philanthropic funders to catalyze funding for nonprofit organizations who are usually have over $1 million in operations, and they catalyze that funding to try to bring their impact to scale. So if you looked at, for example, the people in that group who have signed on to the Audacious Project who support those companies, you'll see like Bill and Melinda Gates and the key ones, but you might also find interesting funders and new networks. So yes, and climate, you're going to start seeing multi-sector partnerships with health, education, you name it, infrastructure. So I would absolutely say it's a good place to start to see what's going on, but also to see who's joined in and you can contact.
So just one plug for the PCDN Career Campus. We just put up a post about when you're thinking about career development, start with the networks first, the network hubs and the ecosystem builder organizations, because that's where you can understand the trends, the hiring, the debates, the policy challenges, and they often have job boards and great networking events, and then go to specific organizations. I think too many people start with an organization, they don't understand the system or the network. Just a little bit of thought. In Audacious Project, they just announced their, 10 latest recipients. So definitely check them out. And I want to put in a plug for Stanford Social Innovation Review, which Absolutely. Puts out, they have some conferences, but also they just consistently, I think they've been around 20, 25 years, but put out some of the best content. It's not a research journal. It's really understanding systems and networks and justice and equity. So follow them on social media or read their articles because they're terrific. And it's a good way to understand the social innovation system in general. So now a question comes from Luis, who is based in Peru. So is there a list of any potential funding partners to build local capacity around conflicts related to extractives? So any suggestions, and Luis, I think our friend Giselle Wamani, she's one of the world's experts, but any suggestions, whether it's specific to extractive conflicts and dialogue or in general, when people are coming to you and say, how do I get funding, whether it's a startup, a nonprofit, where do you generally encourage people to go to understand not just a donor, but understand the broader systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I couldn't give you a direct answer about extractives, but we have startups coming in multiple spaces. So they might be looking for funding for literacy. So I usually encourage them to do a landscaping of their local context or regional context. Who are the funders or the foundations driving this, and where are the funds going? Is there any funds going to new foundations or new groups of people, or is it the same projects being funded? So look at the philanthropic enablers, look at the corporate enablers. So there's a lot of CSR initiatives with banks in particular, but also tech companies and pharmaceuticals. So look to see who might be some non-traditional actors who have not just resources, but in-kind potential for you to be able to access funding or be able to make a sale or do a pilot. But then in ecosystems, I would also reach out to those local incubators, accelerators, or sometimes university connective tissues, because they may be, it depends on the country context, but they may be already tracking what's happening in this space and have some great insight on who you could speak to. So from a perspective of landscaping, I would say there's obviously the big funders. There's sites like PCDN with different opportunities I would refer them to, and different newsletters I would tell them to sign up for, depending upon where they fit. But I think doing a landscaping exercise of your local and regional, and of course then you expand to global to see who is funding this, is important. And to be very honest, I started, because I had to do this on behalf of founders to curate opportunities. I started with LinkedIn searches, keyword searches on Google, and I'm hesitant to put out a particular site, because sites are always coming and going. That's what I found over the last couple of years. I think Opportunity Desk tends to pull in a lot of different types of opportunities like PCDN. But I think if you're just really trying to figure out like the alliances, start talking to people who are well connected and can maybe give you some names. The best way is like have quick chats, get recommendations, always end your conversations with, are there other people I should speak with or organizations I should look at? And then do your research and you'll get a better understanding of the space. There are also those who have already done it. So you might just access a resource where you just have to start digging into specific organizations and affiliation.
Thanks, Madison. So to put in a plug, sorry, I didn't bring coffee, but Alliance for Peace Building was on the board for 2 terms, and that's one of the Network Hub organizations. Their annual conference is in 2 weeks. You can join online. Super cool. And Louise, I think you know about them, but obviously, like, find the network organizations. The Alliance for Responsible Mining. And I will say, despite, and I'm interested to hear your opinion on this. This is more in the nonprofit sector. Despite all the talk about localization, and that, I'm on the advisory board of CDA, which Mary Anderson did the book on Do No Harm, but despite all this talk about locally led development and even startup ecosystems, there's still so many power imbalances and funding imbalances that, yes, more money is available for locals, but it's still often as a subcontractor. But I will say there are great global networks radically pushing for change, like Wings and Civicus and, let's say regional foundations and feminist foundations. And so it is changing, but despite all the discourse in the world, but Madison, my question for you is, how do you see, because there was such a focus on Silicon Valley being like the hub of innovation in the entire world. We live in Medellin, we've become a pretty interesting startup hub, Buenos Aires. So how do you see in the startup and the social impact world, is it becoming equally, talent's everywhere, but is the funding and opportunities and investment becoming equally distributed?
The question, it depends on the so there's definitely more of an emphasis since, I would say, since COVID period, on more diversity and inclusive processes, not just in terms of like the investments, but the processes and practices that go behind it. And so I think there's, for organizations, especially that have a global presence or reporting to another donor, I think they're doing their own audits of how they're being more inclusive, or not. But in terms of the local ecosystems, I think we're actually starting to see some places thrive. They've opened up. They've invited in new talent, but in many places, it's not just about the talent and the funding. It's about the regulatory pieces that restrict entrepreneurs from being able to get capital, right? Or it's about lack of ability or understanding or eagerness to innovate in different industries. So I say all this to say there's a lot of hotspots popping up, but I also at UNICEF see the fragile and conflict affected countries where there's dire resources. The main focus right now is on like humanitarian or basic needs and responsiveness. So thinking through innovation whether it's like convincing donors or whether it's convincing government officials or whether it's just those who would potentially be your customers or users can be challenging. So, in terms of my answer, I would say it's in certain industries, it's there's a lot of money pouring into climate right now. Um, but is there oversight of how this is going to be sustainable? You know, our I've seen a lot of people from the global north going to the global south, capitalizing on opportunities, usually in partnership with others at the local level. But you also question around like the sustainability of these ventures, and to be able to really be run and passed on, to have a local and regional impact. So there's a lot. It's a great time to be in the space, because I think founders who have not been included in conversations or traditionally might have even got to the interview phase are. So if you can really lean into diversity and telling that story, I think it can open doors. But at the end of the day, funders are still very much interested in traction, but there's a whole bunch of factors that lead to that, like that, what I would call the purgatory of like, you build something and you're trying to get traction, but it's not enough. And so a lot of companies die in this mix. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question, but
yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. So we still have a few minutes for questions and comments if people want to put them in. So I'll ask just a simple question. Lots of people dream about working for UNICEF or UNDP or UN Women or any part of the UN system. So any advice for people at any career stage who are like, their dream is to work for the UN in some capacity? So, if you're under 32, you can take the YPO, the Young Professional, whatever exam they offer that, based on certain sectors and country, usually annually. Some countries sponsor, particularly European ones, will sponsor junior professional officers, often for UNDP. But any suggestions for people who really think the UN is a place they want to be? Like, is it networking? Is it having the right set of skills? Is it just what is your advice when people come to you say like, you work for UNICEF and how do I do something similar?
Yeah, I'm still asking myself that. So I will also say one of the things that the UN is doing, similar to your question about Silicon Valley, is they are decentralizing from New York. So they're now looking to have offices and representation in places where they're working the majority of the time. So I think that's important to say, that there's more inclusive opportunities. One of the things I love about the UN is it's very equitable across the board. So they try to have a diverse representation, but sometimes that can come to mean that, I've heard this from people in DC. They're like, well, they don't hire Americans. They don't. So yes, it can be challenging, but sometimes the best route to get into a multilateral is internships and experience. Obviously, networking helps to some extent, but sometimes, so networking helps from my experience to the extent that you might be on a long list or a short list. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll get to the interview phase, but it at least opens the door potentially for an interview through a referral. The other thing I've seen people do is they actually go to the field with different types of roles, and then they get hired in the field as there are needs. So they may go to like a humanitarian zone. So I know people who went, so with the Syrian refugee crisis in Jordan and Lebanon, they went, try to see how they could help out, and eventually found contracts, whether short or long term, on the ground. And sometimes I will also say there is a huge need for technical talent. So sometimes it's just your experience matches what they're looking for. And honestly, I didn't have a referral at all. So mine was just picked up. But the other thing I'll say is, if you are so I'm hiring right now for a consultant position, I do read cover letters. So if you've done research and you start out with a compelling paragraph, like I only have so many minutes of my day where I can review applications. So if you start out with something engaging rather than, generic, and I'm excited about this role because of XYZ, or you've looked up my name and it goes a long way. So it will move you to a pile of like, oh, let me consider this before I shortlist, a long list. So, the YPOs, and there's other programs that help support I'll also say if people are thinking about the UN, I think it's smart to start in your local office if you can. So I know a lot of people want to join as international staff, but if you start in your local office, there's a lot of value to country office and regional office experience that you could later translate to headquarters.
Yeah, and UNV does not lead to a job at the UN after service, but UNV could be a good way, to have online volunteering and field-based. And I think about 90% of the volunteers are local, in their home countries, but it can be a great way to build experience, which could potentially help you get a job. But they're very clear, being part of UNV does not lead to a career at the UN.
Yeah, and I should be very clear. There are very few full-time roles with the UN. So a lot of people end up on temporary contracts. You think the stability, so a lot of people are like a year in and then they start focusing on where they're going after a year. And so it's kind of hopping around. So it is definitely not a easy process because you're constantly having to apply. This is at least what I hear from my colleagues.
So a startup question, I'll ask 2 or 3 more questions. And if anyone else has questions or comments, feel free to bring them in or wants to share something about your own work. So you've been working with startups around the world for 15 years. And I don't want to ask you what is your favorite, but do you have like 1 or 2 examples of startups that you think, where social impact is equal to the business model, that have scaled and maybe, they don't have to become a unicorn, but they've scaled enough in revenue to sustain their work and are just like a good example of how business and social impact could be combined, where you're not sacrificing, the pursuit of money or the pursuit of impact.
Yeah, I'll use the example of one of UNICEF's companies that we've invested accelerated funding in. So they're self-sustaining in the sense that they're revenue generating, but they also are a consultancy in practice. So Thinking Machines is a great organization that is using data to derive insights. They're working across multiple contexts for UNICEF. I'll drop their latest article. So they're building an AI research bank for development for UNICEF at the moment. So they went through our process initially with our seed stage investment and then have continued to stay involved over the last 4 years. So it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of companies start out and they don't necessarily get to sustainable camel status or zebra status, however you want to put it, and immediately. There's a lot of grinding and figuring out your business model and impact. I have seen companies, I wouldn't say they're all in the social impact space. They might be in the fintech space, they might be in the health space, but ones that solve pain points that are real problems, right? That those are the ones that I think have the most impact because people need them, right? And they're going back to them. So whether it's a telehealth app in Jordan, or whether it's whether it's helping ensure that migrants are not paying as high fees when they're remitting money back to their home countries. Those types of things have a real impact. That said, there's a lot of competition in the early stages to get to the status of kind of being the go-to organization. I also want to mention a couple of companies because my time in Baltimore introduced me to some of the most dedicated founders I've ever met. So there's 2 founders in particular. One is Brittany Young, who runs something called B360. So they're teaching STEM through dirt bikes. So they're currently running I believe a $3 or $4 million campaign to be able to build the first dirt bike site in a city urban space. So it's a holistic approach to helping youth, not only with education, but also they have get them in a safe space. So, and one of the most challenging cities in the U.S. She has been an Echoing Green Fellow, Ashoka, a number of others. But she is, with massive build projects like this, you wouldn't necessarily say that this is self-sustaining, right? Because maybe you can pay salaries and such based on what you've raised. But a lot of these companies that are making a big impact that aren't necessarily tech SaaS platforms, the kind that shoot off to be, fast growth, high returns, are doing important work. Another one is Bree Jones, the founder of Parity. She moved to Baltimore because she was passionate about making affordable homes available for for Black middle class families. So Baltimore has a history of redlining. She's come in and done development. She's also doing development work, and that takes millions of dollars. So it really depends on what industry you're in. But at the end of the day, I think the impact and the community you're building around your impact to help sustain it, especially through those hard pushes when you're raising millions of dollars, is so important. So it's not just about you building, but it's also about you building a community around you as your users or your funders as you're moving forward with your growth and hopefully scaling.
So I just have two more questions, and again, if anyone else has one they want to put in the chat. So one is, any advice for people who are starting a startup or a nonprofit, starting an organization, just in terms of how do you develop something that has a chance of being revenue generating? Because there's tons of brilliant ideas around the world. So I mean, just to succeed, like, not everybody needs investment, but like, any advice, like, you've seen, like, what leads to an organization being somewhat sustainable, like around the idea, product, or service, and then just for future cohorts at UNICEF or other kind of international development actors who are supporting startups, just anything you think you would suggest a founder looks at before they apply for your next cohort or some other organization?
Yeah, so if you're starting out with a startup, first figure out what I would say what problem are you trying to solve? Is it an actual problem? So validate the problem itself. Once you've done that, hopefully by talking to people, doing your research and getting data and evidence on the problem itself, then you can start thinking through, okay, you probably have an idea for a solution, but what does that solution actually mean? And so especially in emerging technologies, it can be hard to have a definite fit, but this is where customer discovery and speaking to different persons, customers, profiles is really important to understand their pain points and how your potential solution could solve or alleviate some of those pains. But finding, I mean, one of the key challenges for startups, and I see this every day with the companies I work with, is investors, funders, whether philanthropic, VC, seeds, angels, they want to see evidence of impact. So they want to see that your company has generated some sort of change, right? So the change that you're making. And I would say especially with a social enterprise, or any company should have a theory of change, but like going through the process of understanding, like, what is your impact framework and how do you want to build towards that impact. It may not be the path that you have in mind, because that might not be what's revenue generating. You might find that your company can be a service provider for a large company, and they're going to help you get your feet off the ground. They're going to help you with testing your product. They're going to help you buy in-kind resources. They're going to give you office space. Some of these things are so critical at the early stage. I would also say, don't leave your job unless you have, I mean, you can, but not everyone has the luxury of leaving their job. So a lot of people are doing side hustles. But if you have an idea and you don't necessarily have any data points to validate that it's going somewhere, I would definitely say, be careful around how you're making decisions that might impact the stability in your own life. But look for people who will help you. So get advisors on board. They don't have to be formal advisors, but surround yourself with people who are smart, who think differently, who can challenge you, not only in your leadership, but also in your business decisions, or your tech development, whatever role you're filling. And find a team. Going alone is a lonely journey. And so, if you have people who can help challenge you and motivate you. And then a great way to start is by either getting into an incubator. There's lots of free online incubators these days that can help you touch base, and then you can start competitively looking at companies that give small amounts of investment. Some of it is equity. They take equity in your company. Some of them don't. But that's just how a lot of people move in the traditional route. If you are a frontier tech solution, so if you are an emerging tech company that is using AI, data science, blockchain, drones, and you think you have a solution that can impact children, broadly speaking, the UNICEF Venture Fund launches calls for applications 2 or 3 times a year. And so you can go on our website, UNICEF Innovation Fund, and look for those open calls. I'll also say, I believe there's a tool where you can just submit at any time, but we sometimes have thematic calls. So right now, for example, we are reviewing climate submissions. But, we do startup development quite differently. We don't try to be an incubator and accelerator. We have a work plan, and we help companies build by providing technical advice and strategic mentorship where they are. So we go through the business fundamentals, but because our companies fit in so many different brackets of, some have a business to government, or a B2B or a B2B to C focus, or they don't even know it. They have a great product, but how do they even move forward? We help them test that through expertise over time. So I would say the longer programs tend to be good because you have more access to resources, and I would say take advantage of the resources, take advantage of feedback, but don't always let it impact what the decisions you make. So you're going to get a lot of noise, and you've got to figure out how to cut through the noise. And also make sure self-care is in your schedule, so as much as possible. So schedule whatever it is that makes you happy, or that gives you a sense of calm, whether it's meditation, or it's a run, it's a couple of hours on the weekend to yourself. Make sure you schedule it in, and you don't sacrifice that, because you will burn out.
Yeah, it's very easy to be workaholic, whether one is working in a nonprofit trying to address a huge social challenge, or building a for-profit. I've burnt out multiple times, and it's so easy and with social media, it's even worse. So, my last question is, you're doing an executive MBA. So, why? And then also, just what skills are you, you're a continuous learner. So what skills are you working on currently, or aspiring to work on? And again, any other areas you recommend others, regardless of the sector they might go into, hey, this is important to have this ability, skill-based or knowledge-based?
Yeah, so I was self-taught in a lot of ways. So I feel like running accelerators is a mini MBA in a way, but there's still skill gaps. I didn't actually work on building a financial model or these types of things myself, and spending extensive times on it. So I actually opted to do an executive MBA. I'm doing a program called Quantic. It's radically affordable and accessible. It's app-based, so I can use it on my phone. And it uses all modern tech. It has different streams. So it has your core executive MBA curriculum. So I took it because I needed accountability and a cohort model to learn things like finance and additional strategic frameworks, and be in a group of people where I'm learning. I'm with other people who are very, very busy, but when they come together, they're very focused on learning, and they can draw on a lot of their experience. So Quantic, for example, has people from almost every major tech company in the world. It has a great network. But for me, it was more about finding time to really keep myself accountable to learning as I think through what my next career move is, because with UNICEF, contracts are short, and so I'm actually thinking of making quite a different career move next, which I don't know what it is, and that's okay. But I'm taking the time to learn and sort of reflect. So for people who want to do an MBA or learn, I would say, it's great, but it's huge financial and time commitment. So, just think through what added value will that give you. I found I've already done an MA, and I have built a network and other things through my career. So I didn't feel like the network was something I was lacking. It was more just accountability to myself, and also giving myself space to learn. So so I don't know if that answered all the questions, but I would just say, as you're thinking to upskill, whether it's an area that you're just interested in, you're like, oh, I could think about working in climate because in the future, or I could think about health. There's lots of short courses you can take. There's executive certificates you can take. I actually still find some of these executive certificates quite unaffordable for most people, but it's a better way of getting a brand name without committing. But look into your employer funds. Sometimes they have the ability to pay for some of these learnings. So, use your employer resources to help you in your own journey for upskilling. If you don't have to use it for specific things, I would say that's a great way to pay for it. So,
Thank you. So just Quantic, I haven't taken it, but just it is a really interesting model. One of the founders of Rosetta Stone, I think, was behind it, and they have an interesting model. I think if you're under 8 years professional experience, you can get a free MBA. I think I'm correct with that, and an executive MBA is very affordable. So I encourage people to check it out. For climate, I mean, we do small scale angel investing, so I have a bias, but TerraDo is amazing, and they have programs around the world. Climate Base is also very good in Climate Asia. And I agree, like, yes, sometimes the formal university certificate programs can be great, but sometimes they're so overpriced, and often the experiential learning can be better. So Madison, my last question, just how for people to stay informed both on UNICEF Ventures and also on you, what's the best channel? Like, is there a newsletter, LinkedIn, Twitter, or any other? I mean, I'm not on TikTok, but where do you recommend, like, is the best place for people to follow your work and also UNICEF Ventures?
So my social medias that are not LinkedIn are very personal. They're more about my travels and other things. So if you want to follow my professional world, LinkedIn is the space. If you want to follow my silly travel, as I'm traveling Europe right now, reach out to me and I'll share my Instagram. I'm not going to put it out in public. But yeah, so for UNICEF Venture Fund, I think the best way is sign up for the newsletter. Follow us on LinkedIn. We actually are quite active on LinkedIn and update in real time with different opportunities, whether that's job opportunities or open calls for applications. And if you want to connect, I'm not as good, I'll be honest, because I've taken on an EMBA and work is full on right now. I'm much better at like answering on LinkedIn and doing voice notes. That's kind of how I'm answering questions. So I'm happy to answer any questions that may come in. And, you know, if it makes sense to get on a chat, then we can certainly schedule a call. But, you know, I'm happy to hear your story. And if I can be helpful with pointing in the direction of resources, especially if you're an entrepreneur, feel free to reach out. I'll also tell you if I can't.
Okay. So thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom, energy, and so much great resources. And thank you everyone for participating from around the world. We generally do this weekly. Next week, we should have someone. It's to be determined. And then coming up, we have Darius Graham from Baltimore, so it works in philanthropy. Then we're going to have the former head of Juanes, the musician, his foundation, Mi Sangre, will be, I think, May 12th. I think we're going to have the chief of staff of school. So just follow us on LinkedIn, and because they're like, we'll take a break in July and August, but just amazing people from all over the world. And please check out UNICEF Ventures and check out the PCDN Career Campus, the Rotary Peace Fellowship. I mean, there's so many interesting opportunities out there, the Millennium Fellowship. I mean, basically, there's a lot of organizations that are supporting people, often at low cost or no cost. And I mean, sometimes things cost. So thank you so much, Madison. Have a great
trip. And Craig, a last plug, at least for the for women in the audience or female identifying, there's some great fellowships that also provide affordable coaching. And so I would also check out some of those fellowships for personal development if you're thinking through some of this. I benefited from that. It was a fraction of the cost, and it helped me make some clear decisions around where I was thinking about going with my career. So, you know, it's not just about growth, it's also about personal leadership and learning. So
so thank you. I'll hit end.